All right. Welcome, everyone. It's good to see people coming into the conversation. I think we are ready to get started. My name is Sarah Padilla, and I am the Manager of Initiatives for Keisha Harris and Associates, and I'm excited to be with you today. Before we begin our presentation, our conversation on tools and strategies for DEI implementation during a crisis, I'll just go over a couple of just housekeeping items. So this conversation is being recorded. We will make it available to those of us who aren't able to join us later this week. And you are welcome and encouraged to ask a question or make a comment using the chat box at any time. We will reserve time at the end to open it up for questions and conversation. And while we are in the large group, you will be muted. We'll keep the microphones muted so that we could hear our speakers. And you can also request toward the end by kind of raising your hand as a function to let us know you'd like to make a comment or ask a question. So with that, I'm going to turn the conversation over to our moderator, Keisha Harris. Keisha is the president and CEO of KHA and the director of the InDeep initiative. So I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and thank you everyone for taking time out this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are, to join us for today's conversation. We are looking forward to sharing with you more, thinking across the field about tools and strategies for DEI implementation during a crisis. These webinars are offered as a part of the InDeep initiative, and I know many of you are familiar with this body of work, but just as a reminder, InDeep stands for Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity in Environmental Philanthropy. InDeep is one of two field building initiatives led by KHA, and it provides professional development opportunities for foundation staff and a transformative, constructive space to grapple with tough issues related to racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. InDeep supports environmental grant makers in cultivating opportunities to increase funding for organizations led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. It also supports foundations as they strive for a more diverse and inclusive environmental movement. This conversation is intended to lift up relevant and tactical strategies that grant makers can apply immediately in service of racial equity and justice. During our conversation today, we examine the power of the role of power in grant making. Our presenters will share tools and approaches for doing so. Our shared goal is a longer-term shift toward racially equitable and just practices inside foundations, as well as among the organizations that they partner with. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit more about who's joining us today. Eleni Reifu and Claire Knowlton. Eleni is the Senior Engagement Associate responsible for leading the engagement strategies of the National Center for Responsive Philanthropy's Power Moves project. Having spent the last 6 years in the charitable sector as a fundraiser, then as a program evaluator, she understands how power imbalances manifest and the kinds of systemic approaches necessary to effectively address them. Previously, she was the Accountability and Transparency Systems Manager at the Ocean Foundation, a marine conservation nonprofit and grant maker. We'll also today hear from Claire. She leads the nonprofit finance fund's work on full cost with nonprofits, funders, and government partners. She authored Why Funding Overhead is Not the Real Issue, the Case to Cover Full Cost. She also leads several major initiatives. This includes NFF's work to improve the flow of revenue and capital to organizations combating the homeless crisis in Los Angeles County, and a 6-year effort that combines anti-racism, capacity building, and funding to develop new nonprofit arts models. Eleni and Claire, thank you so much for joining us today. And before we delve into our conversation, I want to invite each of you to share a bit more about your work.
Thank you, Keisha and Sarah, for having me. So I'm the Senior Engagement Associate for the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy. And for those who aren't familiar with NCRP's work, NCRP has been around for over 44 years. Our mission is to promote philanthropy that is responsive to marginalized communities and is prioritizing moving resources to those that have the least wealth and opportunity. And in order to do that, we work various ways. We are known for our research and reports that we conduct on the state of philanthropy. Recently, we've started working in the movement space around immigration and pro-immigration and refugee movements, as well as in health. And so Power Moves and the Power Moves Project is one of those projects we have at NCRP right now, where we are specifically working with funders to change their approach to how they advance equity by explicitly addressing their power, their role in promoting power and holding power, and the systems change that's required in order to move power to their grant partners and to the communities they seek to serve.
Great.
Thanks. Thanks, Keisha and Sarah. And it's such an honor to present alongside you, Eleni. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I am based in Los Angeles, and a little bit about Nonprofit Finance Fund. We have kind of three main arms of work that we do. So we are consultants, we're financial advisors to nonprofits and to funders. We are lenders to the nonprofit sector, and we look for opportunities from our work on the ground as both financial consultants and as lenders to lift up learnings for the sector and say, you know, hey nonprofits, hey funders, here's something that's not working, here's how we can make it better. So in addition to being a nonprofit ourselves, NFF is a CDFI, a community development finance institution, which means we have money from the US Treasury and from commercial banks to lend out to nonprofits. And so our existence as an entity, you know, we're 40 years old. Our existence is really tied to the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act, which was the last major legislative win coming out of the 1960s civil rights movement in the US. So our CEO challenges us every day to ask ourselves, what are we doing at NFF to be worthy of that legacy, to be worthy of the civil rights legacy that we have inherited and that is behind our founding. And so for us, that means figuring out how to make the flow, the deployment of capital into communities fair and just and equitable, and making sure that communities have control over those resources to chart their own destiny. Today I'm going to be talking a bit about our colorblind financial analysis piece. So looking, kind of pulling back the screen on some of the measures, the financial due diligence that funders often do, and that in the past NFF has actually promoted, that pretend to be neutral, that pretend to be colorblind, but are actually tools that reinforce inequity. So I will be talking about some of those things and what we can do differently.
Thank you both for putting your work into context for today's discussion. During the past 5 months, we've experienced the unprecedented public health crisis of COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic, combined with months of protests related to the murders of Black men, women, and children across the country. As a result, we've seen the philanthropic sector grapple with how to respond to the dual pandemics of COVID and racism and move forward toward providing better solutions and support to their grantees. Eleni, your organization created an assessment tool for foundations to examine how they are building, sharing, and wielding power. This tool also helps to identify ways to transform programs and services in service of equitable impact. Please tell us more about the tool, how it addresses power dimensions in philanthropy, and why it may be particularly relevant today to funders in response to the longstanding issues around racism and COVID-19 being a contemporaneous issue?
Yeah. So our Power Moves Toolkit was created from a project that we had where we conducted deep analysis and assessments of how funders were advancing racial equity. And as we were doing those assessments one at a time, we noticed that there was increased demand for both from funders and from nonprofits who wanted us to assess their funders in order to help them, give them some direction in the goals that they should strive for and the approaches that they should have. But then we noticed that because of this demand that there was an opportunity for funders to take on this work themselves. And so we created the tool in order to lay out a way that funders can do this assessment in-house to assess their internal operations, their external grant making, and the relationships that they have with their grant partners and with the communities they seek to serve. So the toolkit is made up of best practices, sample questions in order to assess, sample questions for feedbacks that you can apply with your grant partners, questions to determine how how power plays a role in your grant making. And as you mentioned, the 3 power dimensions we have in the toolkit is building power, sharing power, and wielding power. So building power has to do with the power that as a funder, you're able to build on behalf of the communities you're seeking to serve. So this is something through like civic engagement, through capacity building, and supporting organizing, similar to the types of activism and organizing that we're seeing today around the national protests. And sharing power has to do with your relationship with your grant partners, making sure that those relationships are built on trust, transparency, and are responsive to the grant partners, where the onus traditionally has been that grant partners meet funders where they are, make sure that their work fits the criteria that the funder has set. So we're looking to transform that relationship. And then lastly, wielding power is asking funders to go beyond their grant making and serve as public leaders by being involved in policy and advocacy work in a way that the philanthropic sector has been wary to get involved in. And so when funders first use the toolkit, we ask that you do an assessment of which power areas you'd like to address, and it is designed to fit wherever you are on your journey, whether it's from the beginning or a more advanced level, and it touches on whatever your priority areas are as a grant maker, whatever issues you are working with, it can fit in any of those areas.
Great, thank you for putting your tool into perspective. I have a question for each of you to respond to, and that is, what does power have to do with racial equity? Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, I can start off. So for us, power is the how. So I think we all have an understanding of equity as a concept. And for the Power Moves initiative, we ask that when you're looking at how you're going to advance equity, you have to address power, because you can't have true equity without examining your role in perpetuating inequalities, either in the sector or in the issue areas that you're involved with. And so they're very interlinked for us.
I really appreciate how you said it's the how, Eleni. I feel very similarly. I was going to use language of like both the who and the how. I think, you know, where Nonprofit Finance Fund sits and where we really work in the sector, which is around the flow of dollars, we see, you know, a lot of strong intention and perhaps even change around the who, right? So we're going to move funding or provide more funding, you know, not just to white-led organizations. We're going to make sure that organizations led by and serving Black, Indigenous, people of color, that they are getting a fair share of resources, right? And so a lot of the conversation stays at the who. This question of power is about the how. So if that foundation money is moving and that is flowing and it is going to Black leaders and it is going to Indigenous leaders, but as foundations, we are holding on to the power around that money. So by that I mean, we are putting on like intense restrictions. We are saying, this is how the money will be spent. This is when the money will be spent. That means we are holding the power, right? Like we are keeping that decision-making authority to ourselves and are not allowing the nonprofit leaders to actually exercise their power and deploy their knowledge and really put those dollars to best use. So I think the question of power is everything within equity. Like if we as foundations are not considering the ways in which we currently hold power and the power dynamics in the sector, and then working to shift that power, to release that power, which is like, let's be honest, that is really uncomfortable to say like, I am going to give up this control. I'm going to give up this authority. Like that is the crux of the work. I just really appreciate that question.
Right, and your responses really get into the complexity of the sector and why we feel like this work is so important right now. On the longstanding questions around the how, the question oftentimes is like, how can foundations and what things foundations can do to make their processes, their requirements for receipt of resources more manageable for whomever they may interact with. The who is what we really, really drill down into in deep, which is making sure that as we're thinking about uplifting the leadership of Black, Indigenous, and people of color organizations and individuals, that we're clear that we are trying to create a space for a different type of narrative and not perhaps the gentrification of equity, which says that we're going to put this money into white-led organizations just so that BIPOC leaders can't express and have direct relationships with funders. And so that becomes really important too, both in terms of the who and the how. So thank you for that. Eleni, about a month before the COVID-19 pandemic really began to emerge across the country, you wrote a blog post about the importance of vulnerability for catalyzing change. And that certainly has a lot to do with power and the how. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means and how a funder or grant-making organization needs to show up in terms of practicing vulnerability and having healthier relationships with their funded partners?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that blog into this conversation, because when I was first writing about it, about vulnerability, I was thinking back to my experience of running a DI program at a foundation. And I was thinking about the ways that I saw, at the time I saw my peers showing up, and how I was also directed to show up. And I noticed now, being on the other side, that how much of an obstacle it was that the way we showed up was so guarded, because there was so much of nonprofits or the communities that we served coming and telling us, what issues we needed to address, that we then took back with us and worked on ourselves within the funder bubble. And so that was one of the first things that I wanted to address in this role, in my engagement role at NCRP, is addressing how funders show up, which is to put it all out there, just to put it simply, that funders shouldn't be afraid of failure, shouldn't be afraid of saying the wrong thing, because in the way that we operate in the philanthropic sector, we require that nonprofit organizations or grantees are transparent, that they spell out, what their plans are, what their flaws are, how effective they were, and yet there's no one really putting that lens on funders themselves. And so the onus is on funders to show up in that way in order to to really practice equitable, the equitable principles that they want to instill, that they want to advance in the sector. And so that means transparency, that means being completely open, and being open with your flaws, being open with being open and receptive to feedback. Those would be the three things especially that I think funders can work on, especially now that these conversations have progressed from what we've seen a few years ago. I think we're at a more advanced stage, and there's a higher threshold that we've placed for funders. And I think funders have a lot of work to do to meet that threshold right now.
Fantastic. And I think you put your finger on something really important, and that is thinking about the relationship outside of the parameters of the financial transaction, and really thinking about how you develop relationships with yourself, what types of inquiries you're making of your colleagues within the organization, and the extent to which you are open and amenable to hearing from the organizations that you fund, because the exchange of money is not just foundations paying people, but in fact, the part of the exchange is that when an entity receives a grant for funding with the foundation, that's actually helping the foundation to say, we're actually delivering on impact. We're good, the Department of Treasury, we're doing our part. So it's a two-way exchange. Everyone is accountable to someone else. And so many funders claim that they're very, very committed to racial equity. However, what becomes important is just understanding your own practices and how your practices might be contributing knowingly or unknowingly to injustice and racialized inequalities. Claire, in your tool, you are examining, as you mentioned before, the colorblind financial analysis in grant making, which makes a lot of people and has made a lot of people prior to the summer in particular pretty comfortable. Can you tell us about this practice and what makes it racially biased, and what can funders do about it?
Yeah, thank you. I think working with numbers, we often assume that numbers are neutral, or we want to assume that numbers are neutral. We can look at a financial metric and we can look at it evenly across different types of organizations, and it will tell us something that is true. And I think something that we all know from this work is there is no neutral. There is no such thing as neutral. And certainly, wealth, money in our society has been racialized. We see the racial wealth gap, we see the racial income gap, and we know the histories behind that, often very violent histories of theft and abuse that has extracted wealth from communities of color, from Indigenous communities, from Black communities, to enrich white communities. So that context of how money exists in our society is really important, just as a baseline to acknowledge and to bring into the financial due diligence that we do as funders in making decisions of which organizations we're going to fund or not. I think the other thing that NFF has often seen is financial due diligence being used as a gate to exclude. So organizations must meet some certain marker, and if they don't, they are not eligible. Or we see financial due diligence being used as a hammer to punish, right? If you don't have this type of reporting, or if you don't have this type of structure, then we're coming down on you, we're not giving you as much, or we're gonna really restrict your money because we don't trust you. Rather, at NFF, we like to see financial due diligence used as a flashlight to illuminate, to give a deeper understanding of what type of funding an organization needs and how we as funders can structure that grant to be most effective for an organization. So in this current climate where we have seen many more foundations really explicitly saying like, okay, we have to do better on racial equity. We need to look at who we're funding, and we need to fund more Black-led organizations, more Indigenous-led organizations, organizations led by other people of color. And then they go to look at sort of the structures through which they fund, or the criteria that they have in place, and then go, ooh, here are these organizations that I want to fund that I haven't funded before. And my criteria is getting in the way. My financial due diligence of who we fund and who we don't fund is acting as a gate. It is excluding the organizations that are doing amazing work and should have equal access to the funding that we provide. And since, you know, so many of us sitting in foundation seats as, you know, program officers, the people making those grant making decisions, we are not accountants, we are not the CFO, we don't feel comfortable or confident sort of challenging some of those baseline financial requirements, we let them go. And so we're seeing foundations be challenged like at the moment of implementation. So the intention is good and well aligned, but like the systems are not lining up with how we can actually move money out the door. And NFF, as you know, capacity builders, financial capacity builders, working kind of at the intersection of nonprofits and funders. For years, we have found ourselves in this place where groups of organizations of color doing great work do not meet the criteria set by the foundation. And so then NFF is asked by the foundation, go build the capacity of those organizations to meet our criteria, whether or not that criteria is reasonable, good, appropriate. And so we're very aware of like the problems with that. You know, NFF is a white-led organization. And so being asked to go into organizations of color and essentially like vouch for the foundation that they are worthy of investment, you know, there's a huge problem with that. There's also just the reality that like, no matter how much capacity building we deploy into the sector, there's a lot of nonprofits and far fewer foundations. If foundations can get their criteria right and make their criteria equitable, we are able to, you know, really influence the entire field much more quickly than, you know, theoretically building the capacity organization by organization at a time. So our tool is really a table. We released it about a little under a year ago that names 10 blind spots that we have seen in the way foundations implement their financial due diligence, or sort of the perspectives that they bring to that financial due diligence. We name them, we name how they exacerbate racial inequity, and then we give an alternative, you know, how funders can actually address that. And so as one example, we often see small grants go to small organizations, large grants go to large organizations. So we set some sort of parameter around the percentage of an organization's budget that we will fund. And the reality of that is it doesn't count all of the sweat equity that people are putting in. It doesn't capture the underpayment, the low salaries that people are putting in. It keeps small organizations small. It makes large organizations large. And we know the racial wealth gap in this country, and nonprofit organizations mirror that. And so that small organizations kept small, that often means organizations of color are kept small. And those large organizations kept large, that means big dollars are going to white-led organizations. So teasing that apart and understanding that then gives us as foundations a different way to think about this criteria and say, wait a minute, what are we trying to accomplish? Why are we tagging the grant size that we're giving to organizational budget size? Can we do something else? Can we make significant and meaningful investments into small organizations led by and serving people of color to actually change this dynamic rather than continuing to reinforce an inequitable funding system?
Great, thank you. You hit on some really major points, because our key concern with NDEEP is making sure that as that money moves out of the door, that it lands in more Black and brown hands, which is one of the major concerns in the sector in general, but in particular in environmental philanthropy. You also brought up this really key question, and it is, why are we doing it this way? Like, how do we actually set the stage to change dynamics? Like, where does this rule come from? I mean, there are definitely considerations around things like tipping and making sure that you're not setting up organizations and or yourself to be in any trouble with making grants that far exceed parameters set up by the U.S. Department of Treasury. But the flip side of it is that if you really are partnering with an organization, you can help them to set up the pipeline where they can get more resources from your funding partners, and or you can set the conditions for them to think about what their averages are over a period of time. So some of these questions that we are asking about, like, why is this group getting more than that group, and who do we trust with large money, are things that I think the times really require environmental grant makers to ask the tougher questions, and most important, to take on different practices, including being engaged in discussions within your organizations that would create opportunities for larger dollars to go out over time, if not sooner, for BIPOC-led organizations. So this next question is for you both. Have you seen an uptick in discussion around colorblind financial analysis and other grant-making practices since the emergence of the pandemic over the past 6 months? What other discussions around grant-making practices or policies have emerged this year, notably those with implications for racial equity and justice?
So at NCRP, we've been, since the pandemic erupted, we've been following what funders have been doing and documented them in several blogs and resources that we have on our website. And what we've noticed is that there's been a wide push to focus on general operating support instead of programmatic only support, which is really great news in response to COVID-19, and also to really lessen the reporting and application processes. What we note, though, is that this push has been, where it has occurred, it's been in response to COVID, but there's still not plans to make this the norm or turn this into a long-term strategy for how funders operate their grant-making programs. And that's really where we want to focus in having conversations about power, and where we'd like funders to apply the toolkit specifically is in making these long-term systematic changes, so that, you know, when crises like these come up, it doesn't require a huge shift to change your strategy in order to be responsive. The systems are already in place to help funders be really flexible. Another area is, I think this has been a long conversation in the sector about how much funding is actually given. The requirement's about 5%, and that's really, really low compared to the assets that the philanthropic sector as a whole has, which is not being responsive to the needs, because there's still areas that aren't being funded, and organizations, Black-led organizations, that aren't receiving funding nearly anywhere as close as to white-led organizations. And so there's still these disparities that could be changed if funders would reconsider how they're grant making and how much they could be grant making.
I think you saw me nodding along, Lainey, when you were talking about foundations giving more money. You know, a conversation that hasn't made it into this moment as much as I wish it would is the idea of spend down. And so in this moment, you know, with the multiple crises that we are facing, we're really looking at you know, there could be many organizations that close. Those organizations are likely to be centered in communities of color, and the loss of that infrastructure is huge and will take many years to rebuild. And I know here in Los Angeles, in our nonprofit community, you know, we have heard from leaders who have said the loss of organizations from the last recession is something that we still haven't recovered from. And so what I would love to see is more foundations who will bravely say the survival of that nonprofit infrastructure is more important than my survival. My mission as a foundation is accomplished when those organizations can continue and can be strengthened and outlive me. And so, you know, we, this brave foundation, are going to spend everything down. We are going to put this money out into the community, you know, at this moment to protect and shore up that nonprofit infrastructure that is so vital in communities of color. But that conversation hasn't gotten very far, so that's my pipe dream. One of the conversations that has been coming up a lot, though, is tipping. And Keisha, I'm so glad you brought this up. So prior to joining NFF, I was an auditor and a tax preparer focused on nonprofits. And so I would actually do the like public support test on the Form 990. And one of the things that, you know, just seems to be, the sector seems to have like a narrow understanding of the public support test and of tipping and what it means. So people are aware of one part of the public support test, which is this 33.33% of revenue needs to come from public sources. And it's very complicated what exactly that means, but it's not just 1 year, it is a 5-year look back. And so not just 1 year, one strange year can tip you. Also in that calculation, large and unusual grants are removed from the calculation. So if a significant, you know, a really huge grant gets made, I've worked with an organization that had a $150,000 budget, they got a $550,000 grant, one lump sum from a foundation. We had to work with that foundation to help them understand like tipping isn't going to happen here because this is large and unusual, it gets excluded from the calculation. But that 33.33% test is only one test. There's actually another public support test as well. You only need to pass one. That second public support test is a facts and circumstances test, which says 10% of your revenue needs to come from public sources. Again, 5-year look back. And then you need to explain why you are a public charity. So there's a little bit of writing. You have to say things like, our board is independent. You know, all of this money isn't coming from one family who also controls our board, right? What the IRS is really looking for is that the organization is not a private foundation controlled by one person or one family. You say, you know, here's our fundraising strategy. Here's the way that we're doing broad outreach. You say, you know, look at all these hundreds of individuals that support us in, you know, our low-income community that only can give $5 or $10 a year, and that's meaningful for them. But see how we are broadly publicly supported, right? So there's some writing that you do there. But then, even then, if you are to fail not only the 33.33% test, but you fail the 10% facts and circumstances test, the organization doesn't lose its status. The IRS considers it a private foundation. And so they are then subject to the same excise tax that private foundations are subject to. So at NFF, we have been looking pretty diligently for 5 or 6 years for any example of an organization that has actually been tipped. We have not yet found one. I am asking every single foundation on this call, if you know of an organization that has actually been tipped, we would love to know about it. We're pretty sure that tipping is a myth that maybe got started by like a lawyer that didn't know how to properly read the IRS code. This is our suspicion. But yeah, that's my my rant on tipping. We're hearing a lot about that. And also a lot about the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. So if folks haven't checked that out yet, like that's amazing relational work with grantees. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, because I'm breathing a collective sigh of relief that we've got an audience of people that are hearing about tipping. And before we move to the next part of the discussion, why don't you talk a little bit about trust-based philanthropy, if you don't mind, just to kind of put that into perspective, because we've talked a lot about the financial transactional pieces, and you know, here and there we've talked about the importance of the relationships. But, you know, just if you wouldn't mind just introducing the concept into this conversation, and how it plays into issues around racial equity and justice, because the only way we're going to change as a sector is if we change who gets the money. So, Claire, both of you would like to speak about it, please do.
Sure, happy to. So the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, which I am a huge fan of and partner with on the side, but am not, you know, leading in any way. It is a 5-year project that's kind of primarily come out of the Whitman Institute, which is a Sundown Foundation, and some other partnered foundations. And it is really looking to address power in the sector. And so they have brought together 6 core principles, none of which are new, but the bringing them together and the naming them together as trust-based philanthropy, that is something new. And so some of those principles are things like give multi-year unrestricted support, do the homework, be transparent and responsive. These different principles are all grounded in a set of values that is around trust and respect, and partnership with grantees. And so the implementation of those principles is really like the implementation of those values. And so when we talk about, you know, shifting power as being core to racial equity work, and when we talk about like vulnerability and relationships as being core to racial equity work, I think the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project gives a really nice grounding of how to implement those things. And so if you like go to their website, trustbasedphilanthropy.org, you'll find a series of webinars they're really conversations with foundations that have put these principles into practice. They have one on each principle. You'll find stories from foundations of, you know, how they've gone about doing this work and how it has made their work more meaningful, more impactful. You know, how they as funders have also really benefited from the relationships and the learning and being able to do better and smarter grant making because of their close connection to grantees.
We've actually partnered with the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project because we noticed that they do a deeper dive on our sharing power dimension, which is all about funder relationships with the grantee. So I fully endorse Claire's endorsement. They're doing really great work and they're meeting funders where they are and creating that peer network in order to have these conversations in an honest way and offering a space where funders can be vulnerable. So yeah, they're really great. You should definitely check them out if you haven't.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sure I really appreciate this rich discussion and the opportunity to expand and share with the audience a bit more about the relational part of the transaction. I am going to, I know we have one question so far in the box. I'm going to invite others who are here to please feel free to chime in. You can use the Q&A box to add questions and or raise your hand. But I'm going to turn things over now to my colleague, Misty, and she will review questions as they come in through the chat box. Misty.
Thanks, Keisha, and thanks, Eleni and Claire, for a great conversation. We did have one question related to the resources that were shared today that came through the chat box. And so I just wanted to confirm that we will send a follow-up email to all attendees with links out to those resources, as well as Eleni's blog post and the Trust-Based Philanthropy website. So be on the lookout for that later today. So like Keisha said, if you have questions for either of our panelists or both of our panelists, please feel free to submit those in the Q&A box, which you can find in the lower portion of your Zoom screen or in the chat box. And we will start with a question, looks like it's for both of our guests. What criteria can a funder use to measure the how of equity? And are there best practice measures or metrics?
I can start. So for us in the toolkit, we spell out exactly what it looks like when you effectively address the how. So in those 3 power dimensions. So in building power for the communities that you're seeking to serve, what does that look like? That looks like funding specific things that haven't been funded before, like civic engagement, like grassroots movements. And with sharing power, it's things, specific concrete things like creating a system whereby your grantee partners can give you feedback, establishing a 2-way communication system, creating, making sure that your grant making prioritizes general operating support instead of project specific ones. So there are definitely specific criteria for what that looks like in our toolkit.
I think the only thing I might add to that on the financial side would be to, track the demographics and the dollar amount against demographics of grantees, and then also the type of funding. So one of the things that we've definitely heard and seen through some different studies is organizations led by people of color, and I think especially Black women, have a much harder time accessing unrestricted support. And so when you are looking at your portfolio of how your grants are being deployed, looking to see where that unrestricted money is concentrated, and making sure that it is going to Black, Indigenous, community of color organizations would be one criteria I'd include.
Great, thank you both. I've got a question. I think this is addressed to Eleni, but probably both of you are welcome to chime in if you'd like. So Eleni, you mentioned being open and receptive to feedback earlier on. Can you provide an example of how this might look between a funder and a grantee?
Yeah, so it starts with establishing a trusting relationship and making sure that the times when you do connect with your grant partners isn't when they're applying for the grant or when they're reporting back on how they've used the grant. It's having this continuous dialogue and the kind of relationship where they feel comfortable and they trust that they can be honest with you. So what this looks like is that you do the homework, like the Trust-Based Philanthropy explicitly cites on their principles, making sure that you're in this space, you're not waiting for nonprofits to come to you and tell you, what they need. It's about being proactive and being like establishing systems where they can provide that conversation for you beyond just the grant cycle, the grant process. So one way that we've seen funders do this around the COVID response is by creating like a space to convene. So they've set up regular meetings where the nonprofits can dial in and talk about what they're dealing with at the moment, what they need. And so just having that designated place assured their grant partners that they were there to be heard and that the funder was willing to be held accountable to what they heard in that meeting. And so just to sum up, it's about creating a system by way your grant partner can communicate with you whatever feedback they have, and also making sure that you're the one proactively creating that space. You're not waiting for your grant partners to take the initiative to come to you.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think the things I would add are be really clear about why you're seeking feedback, and only seek that feedback when you're willing to act, or be very clear about how that might be used. I would say that there's also like the need to do this consistently over time. There can be a risk for nonprofits in sharing honestly. That risk might be real, it might just be perceived. But nonprofits will be honest with their funders up until they reach that line where they think they are putting their community in jeopardy because they're putting the funding in jeopardy. And so the ability to develop a relationship, and a trusted relationship, is not something that happens in 1 or 2 or 3 conversations. That is something that often happens over years. And so I would say, like, keep at it and demonstrate that critical feedback does not come back and harm an organization by leaving them out of an opportunity, or reducing funding or things like that. And I would also say, like, just be really plain and transparent about your values up front. I am asking this question because, I'm asking this question because we're not sure our grant making process is really as easy as we think it is. And we're trying to seek, feedback on how we might improve it from our end users, which is you. And anything you share with me, this isn't going to affect any sort of grant making decision. We're looking to learn, right? Just saying, like, very plainly why you are asking the question can go a long way to helping an organization, helping that nonprofit leader, like, figure out the calculation of, how do I respond to this question that does not put my funding at risk?
I would also add one more thing. In addition to what you said, it's important that traditionally funders have tended to be a little bit more extractive in this process. And so it's important that you also close the loop whenever you do any kind of survey of your nonprofits, because often funders survey their nonprofits and then they keep that information internally, and nonprofits never understand why. And so, to your point, Claire, it's definitely important that this is a two-way relationship, that the information you're collecting doesn't just benefit you and how you operate, but also goes back and supports and benefits the operations and the programs of the nonprofits that you're working with.
Our next question is for Claire. In considering a large grant to a small organization, has your organization discussed providing some kind of support to help that organization's capacity to manage a large grant, something like supporting a part-time or contracted account manager?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, large grant can mean many different things. So I will opine on a large grant being a transformative grant, right? One in which the funding is so significant that it really has the potential to change the way the organization is operating, the scale, the type of activities it does, the way it pays its people, the way it does its fundraising. And so in that case, it's really important that transformative dollars be deployed very thoughtfully and really in partnership with the organization. We do know that large amounts of money just dropped into an organization can be destabilizing. And so the example that I gave earlier of a nonprofit with a budget of $150,000 that got a $550,000 lump sum grant, there was a year and a half of planning with that organization for what their ask was going to be, even before that, who they wanted to be in their community, what they needed to get there, how much time they would need to get there, the people, the systems, the skill sets, like all of that. And so that all went into a very thoughtful ask with a partnered foundation who asked really good questions back. And there was a lot of dialogue in figuring out how to deploy that big lump sum of money so that it wouldn't be destabilizing, but that it would be catalytic. So if you are talking about, not a large grant that's like, large in that, hey, it's 25% of your budget, that's a big grant, that's large, but probably won't destabilize an organization. Something that's 4 times their annual budget, that could be like, whoa, right? So providing the right support up front in partnership with the organization so that they are able to chart their own course with trusted advisors alongside to help them think about the systems, the personnel processes, the way in which they want to plan to spend that money down, and how they are building the capacity to replace that over time so they don't reach the end of the grant and then sort of like fall off a cliff. That's really important. I think there's also, opportunities to deploy capital where the transformation is not so much about changing the way that the organization operates per se, but it is about addressing historical challenges. And so an organization that I worked with had gone through some really difficult periods, had arrived at a place where they had 2, really strong women of color leading the organization who had really righted their course and gotten the organization back on track. And having done so, the family of the founder of that organization, who's a recognized, documented civil rights leader, came to them and said, hey, so where is our dad's retirement money that he was promised when he left? And the leaders had no idea about this. And they talked to the board, and the board had, it generously kind of awarded a much deserved and too small, though it was large for the organization, a retirement package for this amazing founder of the organization. But at the time that they had done so, the organization was in extreme financial distress. The founder never tried to collect on it. But now that the organization was sort of financially sound, his children were coming back, asking for this money that was owed to their dad. And there was no way for that organization to move forward with credibility in their community without meeting that need, without fulfilling that debt. And so in working together, we helped them get some what we call recovery capital, which is to kind of address those historic needs, kind of get an organization back to, back on solid footing. And that money was, primarily to pay that retirement package, right? To restore that trust and those relationships in the community. And so they were able to do a really wonderful send-off for this civil rights leader and give him a giant check and move forward as an organization, kind of, having paid that debt and being made whole.
All right, so we have time for a couple more questions. The next one is for both of you, and I will defer to Eleni first. Do you have any best practices or suggestions on best practices for how to facilitate deeper, more relational grant making with limited staff resources and bandwidth?
Sure. So the toolkit is designed to focus on making systemic changes. And so whatever resources, bandwidth, capacity you have, as long as the approach you take is systemic, you integrate a power lens in your operation and your grant making, it should be able to function on its own, ideally. And so I think if you focus on just integrating it in how you normally function, so starting with how you set your strategic plans, for example, if you incorporate feedback from your nonprofits, if you make sure that you set time aside to co-create strategies, that's one of the ways that you already set up the system so that there isn't anything extra that you do. So in the beginning, there might be an investment of capacity, but afterwards, it should be part of your normal operation.
I think I might add to that that there can be opportunities to look at the activities that we are currently doing as a foundation and determine how beneficial those are to our grantees, to our strategy. Sometimes in our field, like, we make a lot of work for ourselves. And so if relationships is something that we prioritize, how can we think about our grant making approach, our processes, our practices, the documents that we gather or don't, the things we review or don't, in light of that ideal of being oriented around relationships first? So, like, how do we design our structures to make sure that we prioritize that and there is time for that?
So we have a great question that just came in about risk. What are some tactics to encourage foundations and their boards to take these kinds of steps towards sharing power that are perceived as much more risky? And how can we think usefully about financial and other risk in this context?
I'm happy to start, and then Eleni, have you add on. I would first ask the question, what do we consider risk? Like, when we say risk, what do we mean by that? So do we mean, risk that money will be misspent? What would it mean for money to be misspent? Sometimes that language of risk is like, it's not clearly defined. And so I would start there. I would add to the equation, what is the risk of not funding this organization? So who may be harmed, or who may lose services, or who may not, what sort of power building activities may not continue in a community if this organization is not funded, right? Because there's a risk there as well. I think that you can also think about funding within a portfolio approach. And so if risk for you is about not knowing the organization, we don't have a lot of we don't have a relationship with them, we haven't developed trust yet, we don't know that they have the capacity to deliver on what we are agreeing to within this grant, then you may think about your grant making as a whole and say, like, okay, 20% of our dollars are going to go to those organizations that we don't know well, and this is a testing ground and this is a new way. But 80% of our funding is going to those organizations who we do know well. I'm sort of making up these numbers, right? But you can think about however you are defining risk, you can think about then funding across a continuum, because you have a whole portfolio. And so we're going to fund organizations that seem higher on that metric, and we're going to fund organizations that seem lower on that metric. But interrogating what you mean by risk first, I think, is really important. And most of the foundations that I've had this conversation with, when I ask, like, what do you mean by risk? What does that mean to you? They often respond with, like, oh, that's a good question. There are fewer foundations that have a really immediate response to that. So I think there's a lot to unpack and consider in that question.
Yeah, I agree with you, Claire. I think starting with the question of what kind of risk and risk to whom is definitely the first place to start, because they might not have the same definition or understanding that you might have about what the risks are. And then in practice, some of the approaches that we've seen success with is finding other funder allies to kind of show, you know, a model of the types of approaches that they've taken that your organization or your board might find risky, so that, you know, they know that this isn't requiring them to pioneer anything. Most likely it's something that has been done before and has been done effectively, or there are resources to kind of guide you along. And so once you set the definition, I think finding allies would be a natural next step.
Thank you so much. We have one last question, and it is, what advice do you have for advancing more equitable relationships with a board that has lots of concentrated decision-making power?
Direct them to us. Yeah, so our NCRP primarily works with CEOs and presidents, because a lot of the times to make advancements in this work, you have to have buy-in from those in power. And so we definitely have the resources and the specific approaches and the networks. But so apart from that, I would also say lean into the networks that you are a part of. So one could be InDeep, for example, because most likely other organizations, other funders are having the same conversations. And so bringing them together and working together would I think, lessen the radicalness of whatever approach that you are trying to get buy-in from your board about. And so really creating awareness about others who are doing the work, and making them more aware about what's involved would be two concrete steps to take, because a lot of times it's not having enough information about what's entailed that leads to resistance.
Yeah, I feel like that that question, there can be so much behind it. I think at the root of a lot of these things, we're talking about culture change, right? We're talking about culture change within a foundation. And so to answer that, you know, I would want to know so much more about the board and who they are and how long they've been there and how they interface with staff and where funding happens and how connected or disconnected the board is from those organizations that are funded. And, you know, there's so many layers. And so I really appreciate Eleni's answer, and like, yeah, call NCRP. That sounds good. But I think there can be like many different approaches depending on sort of the context in which this question exists. And that may be bringing in third parties, that may be connecting to other boards, that may be something that is led by staff, that may be something that involves like grantee voices, or you know, bringing to light certain like reports or other best practices. How you go about sort of shifting hearts and minds is, you know, that's like the thing we're all trying to do all day, right? So yeah, I'm sure that is a helpful consultant non-answer. It depends.
All right, thanks so much, Eleni and Claire, and to everybody who submitted questions. As a reminder, again, we will send out an email this afternoon with some links out to some of the tools that were mentioned. And you can check your email in a couple of days for a link back to the recording of this webinar as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
All right. Hi. Thanks, Misty. So thanks again, everyone. This has been such a rich and fascinating discussion. And it's really just interesting. And I'm sure we could, you know, will continue to have these conversations. So before we go, I just wanted to share a couple of upcoming dates for the INDEEP webinar series. You'll be able to find more information on our website, but we do have 3 online sessions that are coming up in the fall, and we'll make more information available about those soon. We really appreciate everyone's support of INDEEP and look forward to continuing this journey with you and learning from all of you. And KHA would love to be of support to your organization. You know, we work across multiple program areas, and you know, would love to be able to explore ways in which we can support this good work. So please reach out to me or to Keisha or Misty if you have any questions or would like to talk about this further. And we just look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you. And this webinar is now concluded.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.